Today we will be doing something a bit different because I want to. This will come as no surprise to those who know me, but I do love me a good ghost story. I am also, incidentally, a complete wimp, so I do tend to gravitate towards those written in the 20th century, which are decidedly less scary than their modern day counterparts. All you have to do is compare the BBC Ghost Story for Christmas episodes with their literary sources to see how much they are faffed with to make them actually scary. But I digress. I have not written an in-depth review of a book as such, but instead have written several short reviews and ratings for the stories in this book, The Haunted Library, a collection of ghost stories gathered by Tanya Kirk, all of which feature some link to libraries or books. Some links more tenuous than others. These stories all come from the early to mid-20th century, so from about 1910 to 1963. Not only do they illustrate how literature and the ghost story changed over that short period of time, but showcase a variety of voices, both male and female, famous and obscure. So let's jump in. Edith Wharton is probably better known for her social commentaries like The House of Mirth, Ethan Frome and The Age of Innocence, often focusing on issues such as the repression of women and how this manifests in unhappy relationships. Often using gothic motifs to explore the cages built around women by society, the ghost story was only a small hop away. In this tale afterwards, which reads almost as a blend of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper and Oscar Wilde's The Canterbury Ghost, an American couple move into an old country manor in the English countryside. Keen for an authentic experience, they forego modern conveniences such as electric lights and hot water. The only thing missing from their period property is a ghost. Or is it? I give the story 5 out of 10. It's much too wordy and fussy to be scary. The ghost element was alright, but got rather lost in the writing. But this story does get a bonus point for humour. Montague Rhodes James is probably the most popular ghost story writer. Not necessarily because they're scary, but because he wrote so many, several of which have been the basis for other stories and films. The BBC series A Ghost Story for Christmas is especially fond of his work, with 5 out of the 7 of their original series being based on his stories, and a further 7 out of 8 of the episodes of the revival series. The most famous of his stories is probably I Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, because it has been referenced in so many other things, including Father Brown and another book I happened to be reading recently. It was also the first BBC Christmas ghost story that I watched, and it traumatised both me and my mother. The original tale, however, not quite so scary. The story in this book is The Tractate Middoth, which was also adapted by the BBC in 2013. It follows a librarian who, after receiving a request for a Hebrew volume, is pulled into the nefarious story of the late Dr. Rant and his penchant for cruel tricks. I give this tale a 6 out of 10. A typical M.R. James special in which supernatural forces do unreasonably evil things, then sod off for no reason.
I am the greatest! Mwah! Now I am leaving Earth for no reason!
Edmund Gill Swain, a contemporary and friend of M.R. James, is probably largely unknown these days. He was chaplain of King's College, Cambridge, and afterwards became the vicar of Stanground near Peterborough. In contrast to James's mysteriously malevolent ghostly forces, Swain took a more wholesome approach. He wrote a book called The Stoneground Ghost Tales, a series of related ghost stories inspired by his parish and featuring a recurring rector, Mr. Batchel, who was essentially Swain's self-insert. Bone to His Bone is one of these stories. Mr. Batchel finds at the vicarage of Stoneground a rather splendid library, meticulously put together by his predecessor, Vicar Whitehead. However, Whitehead may have left behind more than just books, and the library has become restless. I give this tale a 7 out of 10. It's not scary, but it had a solid ghost element, and overall, it gave me good vibes. Algernon Blackwood is one of those names I've always been aware of, but didn't know that much about. Funnily enough, he cropped up in another book I've been reading about the history of the occult, because of course I was. In life, Blackwood was interested in the occult and mysticism. He joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the members of which also included Bram Stoker and Aleister Crowley. He's written tons of stories, all in that nebulous galaxy of horror, fantasy, gothic, weird fiction. You may have heard of some of his more famous stories. The Willows, for instance, or The Wendigo, or his novel The Education of Uncle Paul, from which Tolkien derived the phrase crack of doom. Or you may know Blackwood as a character from the David Yancey book Curse of the Wendigo. And even if you haven't, his influence on the horror fantasy genre is huge, inspiring several writers including H.P. Lovecraft. The Whisperers is a strange story. It is about a man called Jones who is a writer, and written about with such passion and intricate detail with regards to the writing process that one wonders if Jones is a sort of fictionalised version of Blackwood himself. Easily influenced and inspired to the detriment of his deadlines and word count limit, Jones takes himself to his cousin's very plain attic to write without the intrusion of ideas. But the attic isn't as plain as he had once thought, for who knows what was there before, and who knows what remains. I gave this tale a 5 out of 10, and it's lucky to get that. It's atmospheric, but it's just a bit too weird to really make you feel that much. I suspect Blackwood wrote this after taking something slightly illegal. Henriette Dorothy Everett, or Theo Douglas, as to use her pen name, is all but forgotten these days. However, at the time of writing, she was a popular novelist, and her collection of ghost stories earned praise from Senior Spooky himself, M.R. James. Sadly, we don't know a huge amount about her, but looking at some of the novels she's written, she sounds like a really interesting person and definitely worth a go. Especially if you like these weirdy, supernatural, sometimes sci-fi-esque stories with a twist of romance. In this tale, recounted by a slightly rambling, erring on stream of consciousness voice, we hear about what should have been a nice family holiday at the seaside, but that turns into something else when messages begin appearing, writ by an unseen hand. I gave this tale a 6 out of 10. A good premise, but the mismatched tone and flat ending left me wanting. May Sinclair, again largely unknown these days, deserves better. She lived a rather tragic life, pitted with the deaths of various family members. May never married, though ended up inheriting children from 2 of her dead brothers, but had taken a keen interest in psychology. She was a member of the Society of Psychical Research, which looked into the science of paranormal activities, and was involved in the fight for women's rights and suffrage. A very cool lady indeed. The nature of evidence has been described as a sort of inversion of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which is impressive as this was written a good 15 years beforehand. After the death of his beloved first wife Rosamond, Edward Marston remarries the beautiful Pauline. But though Rosamond is dead, she isn't necessarily gone. I gave this tale a 9 out of 10. Solid ghost story. Squicky ending, but in a good way. Well done. Known more for writing about the countryside, Mary Webb never achieved fame during her short life. She suffered from Graves' disease and died at the age of 46 after the failure of her marriage. And yet she remained a compassionate and generous person, opposing blood sports and giving to the poor even when impoverished herself. She was praised in a speech by Stanley Baldwin a year after her death, and is the pioneer of the genre known as soil and gloom romance, or Lomond Lovechild. Her books are likely a source of inspiration, too, for Stella Gibbons' pastoral parody called Comfort Farm. But Mary Webb was also capable of writing humour. Despite the passionate, tragic novels, her short story Mr. Tallant's Ghost is anything but. It follows an unnamed narrator whose life is changed after a fateful meeting with the titular Mr. Tallant, an unpublished writer with many stories to tell. A promise given to Mr. Tallant and soon afterwards forgotten, but comes back to haunt him when Tallant dies. Now a narrator realises that there are many stories not worth telling, but 1 or 2 that perhaps are. I gave this tale a 10 out of 10. It's not scary, but it's very funny, and it is the best story in the book. It's not easy playing second fiddle to a more famous sibling. But this was the fate of Dennis McHale, whose sister was Angela Thirkell. Though, truth be told, I haven't heard of either of them. Dennis worked in many areas during his life, including the theatre, the War Office, the Board of Trade and the British Museum. He was a prolific writer to supplement his salary, but the only book that really survives him is a novel called Greenery Street. The Lost Tragedy is a more humorous tale, told by the owner of a sprawling bookshop about a tome so rare and dangerous, not even death can stop those who would see it destroyed. I gave this tale a 7 out of 10. Nice main character and an excellent opening. But the actual ghost story was just a bit pants. I was going to give this a 6, but I decided the first section was worth the extra point. Margaret Irwin only has a very small paragraph written about her in this book. Wikipedia doesn't have much more because apparently the only thing of note about her is that she's better known as a writer of historical novels. She did write a couple of fantasies though, so they may be worth a look. In the book, avid reader Mr. Corbett finds all is not well with his bookcase, nor his book taste, when he inexplicably loses all interest in everything. But one book revives his zest for reading, a strange manuscript handwritten in Latin from his uncle's personal library. But there are books that are not meant to be read, and books that are not meant to be finished. I gave this tale a 9 out of 10, another solid ghost story. It could have been a little bit more brutal though for that elusive 10th mark. Elizabeth Bowen sees us step into a more contemporary view of the humble ghost story. Not as a vessel for spooky spectres, but as a way to explore modern problems, uncertainties and issues with our own psychology. Following the death of her mother when she was 13, Bowen went on to pepper many of her stories with orphaned children and trauma, as is seen in The Apple Tree. Simon Wing's wife has never fitted in with his friends, and indeed many were surprised he would marry at all. But one evening after a concert, they stay the night at Simon's house, and find that the elusive Mrs. Wing may be more than the strange, quiet creature they have taken her to be. I gave this tale an 8 out of 10. It's a good short story. I err on calling it a ghost story, as the ghost is more psychological, but it's very good all the same. Alan Noel Latimer Munby gives us our first post-World War II story. He was a prisoner of war and began writing whilst at the German prisoner of war camp near Eichstätt, where the Bishop Michael Rackel gave prisoners access to his printing press, allowing them to produce a magazine called Touchstone. It is in this magazine that Munby was first published. Herodus Revivivus, which I cannot say, clumsily translated as Herod Recycled, is another tale as told by a character within the story. Here, after a conversation turns to an obscure volume once belonging to a madman, the main character is prompted to recount his days as a schoolboy, the mysterious bookshop he used to frequent, and the mysterious bookseller who truly valued a returning customer. I gave this tale a 6 out of 10. It's a very good frame narrative, but a rather dull story. William Croft Dickinson, historian and first Englishman to be appointed a chair at the University of Edinburgh. Whilst working there, he began to write ghost stories, and a good thing too, as he would come to give us probably the scariest tale in this collection. The work of evil is more of a warning than a story. To all those drawn towards the strange, the macabre, the obscure, the leather-bound volumes that grow mould and mildew on forgotten shelves, sometimes it's better to leave them alone. As one librarian learns, some books are better left forgotten. I gave this tale a 10 out of 10. It's not very funny, but it is very scary. A brilliant ghost story, top marks. And that completes our spooky selection. I hope you enjoyed this detour from the usual. I have noticed a similar book to this in the library about mummy stories, which honestly I didn't even know was a thing. At least I didn't know it was a popular enough genre to require an anthology. But there we go. And perhaps I'll do another video in this format about that one, but only time will tell. Good night.